Good morning, everybody. As always, thank you for being with us. We have another great presentation today. And as usual, before we get into those presentations, we'll do our weekly updates. We'll get right into that and start with Dr. Collins.
Thanks, Errol. So I'll just very quickly go through the numbers for COVID-19. To start with, I titled my slide Continued Optimism. I think what we're seeing is that nationally and locally, the numbers do continue to go down, as well as our census at Stanford. And then just as of yesterday, there's now 2 counties in the Bay Area that have gone from purple to red. So small bit of progress, Marin and San Mateo County. And actually, if you look at adjusted case rates and other metrics, some of the other counties, including Santa Clara, are not that far behind. As far as our adult inpatient demographics updated this week, we identified 41 additional patients who were in one of our hospitals with SARS-CoV-2, of which 36 were at Stanford's hospitals in Palo Alto. And then in terms of percentages from the demographics across the different metrics that we've been tracking, they're pretty similar. And we also updated some length of stay and 30-day readmission data. Our median and mean length of stay are basically the same that we've reported before. And they've pretty much been that way through time, through the pandemic. Our 30-day readmission rate seems to be creeping up a little bit, now close to 11%. This is as we're getting more data through the winter surge we just had, now through January 23rd, that allows for a 30-day follow-up. So we'll keep track of that, see where we end up as we accrue a little bit more data through the end of January. And that's it. Just a very brief update. I want to make sure I thank the folks, especially Isabel, who helps quite a bit with gathering these numbers.
Thanks so much, Dr. Collins. Dr. Pinsky, thanks for being with us to update on variants and anything related to lab stuff.
Thanks, Errol, and good morning, everyone. We're continuing our genomic surveillance of the positive cases that we have at Stanford. And here's our update. Notably, we identified 1 additional South Africa variant over the last week, although our numbers of variants of concern remain quite low compared to the number that we've screened and sequenced. And the West Coast variant, which has received a bit of press of late, remains at about 1/3 prevalence. About 1/3 of our positives are detected for this particular variant. So that's the variant update for this morning. And also, I'm happy to take any questions in the chat.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dr. Pinsky. I'd like to just first say, as we end our last grand rounds of February, I want to thank all our speakers this past month. Thanks to Dr. Dunn, who's going to speak in just a moment here, Dr. Caceres, really Kathy Garza as well, a lot of people in Diversity Inclusion Committee. This past month, we've aimed to honor African American History Month, but we also want to say that this is not just kind of the end of this month. This is really marks the beginning of an Inclusion 2020 theme where we'll be having many speakers throughout the year. And we're really excited to have that. For example, next week we have Dr. Deidre Cruz, who's going to be talking about diversity as well, and also helping us celebrate National Kidney Month as well. So we're excited for that. Dr. Shannafelt and Dr. Glickman from Blue Shield will be talking the following weeks after that. So we'll be continuing to have themed presentations in grand rounds and in other ways throughout the year to really focus and talk about inclusion with our Inclusion 2020 theme. And with that being said, Dr. Tamara Dunn, our Associate Chair for Diversity Inclusion, will be introducing our guest of honor today, Dr. Boyd. So Dr. Dunn, I'll turn it over to you. And yes, got it.
The sun has come out since, excuse me for one moment.
No problem.
So sorry about that.
No problem.
Hello, everyone, and good morning. Here we are on our final Black History Month grand rounds. We've had an entire month of incredible talks, and today is no exception. While February has only 4 days remaining, we want to remind you that Black history is 24/7, 365, And all year long, we're going to be honoring Black voices that have been historically silenced, marginalized, or overlooked. Again, I want to thank my partner in DEI, Dr. Caceres, Dr. Wendy Caceres, Dr. Harrington, Kathy Garzio, the faculty and staff on the Diversity and Inclusion Council for supporting us and making this month and Inclusion 2021 a reality. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rhea Boyd. So Dr. Boyd is a pediatrician. She's a public health advocate and scholar who writes and teaches on the relationship between structural racism, inequity, and health. She has a particular focus on the child and public health impacts of harmful policing practices and policies. She serves as the Chief Medical Officer of San Diego 211 and is the Director of Equity and Justice for the California Children's Trust. She and Black healthcare workers across the nation have partnered with Kaiser Family Foundation and the Black Coalition Against COVID-19 to produce The Conversation, a living library of credible information about COVID-19 vaccines created by Black folks for Black folks. Dr. Boyd graduated cum laude with a BA in Africana Studies and Health from the University of Notre Dame. She earned her MD at Vanderbilt University School of Medicine and completed her pediatric residency just up the road at UCSF. In 2017, she graduated from the Commonwealth Fund Mongan Minority Health Policy Fellowship at Harvard University's School of Public Health, earning her MPH. And on a personal note, we've had a friend in common who's been trying to connect us for years. So finally, here we are, Dr. Boyd. Welcome, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dunn, for that kind introduction. Let me just share my screen. Hold on one second. Okay, I'm just thrilled to be here. I'm excited that you invited me to talk about anti-racism. I'm excited as a pediatrician to talk to internal medicine docs, because what we're going to talk about today is something that affects us across the clinical sciences. I'm going to try to issue an anti-racist imperative and to really speak to the urgency of us taking up anti-racist practices across the sciences. I left my Twitter handle on this first page, which is also my email address if you add @gmail to the end. So if there are questions that we don't have time to get to today, please feel free to email me and I can follow up. I don't have any disclosures. So let's jump in. If we're going to talk about anti-racism and why there needs to be an urgency for us to address racism in this way, we first have to ground ourselves in what we mean when we're talking about racism. And here, I think the articulation of author Ta-Nehisi Coates is perhaps most apt. He says in his book, Between the World and Me, but all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. We must never look away from this. We must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. Whether that violence is the physical violence of policing or the structural violence of inaccessible healthcare, racism lands with violence on the body. Or as colleagues and I said in Health Affairs this past summer, racism remains a bloodying force that truly structures every facet of American life. And if we're honest, every facet of medicine. And so we're going to begin our conversation here and talk about what racism looks like in our own workforce. This is a picture of Alan Bakke. In 1973, Alan Bakke was a 33-year-old white male veteran, and he applied to 12 medical schools, including UC Davis. In 1973, he was denied admission to all 12 medical schools. In 1974, he again applies to UC Davis, and he again is denied admission. He goes on to sue UC Davis for denying him admission by claiming that UC Davis discriminated against him through their special admissions program. In 1973 and 1974, when he applied to UC Davis, there were two admissions programs, the general admissions program and the special admissions program. The general admissions program had a GPA cutoff of 2.5, below which candidates were summarily denied admission. The special admissions program had no GPA cutoff and was intended for students who self-identified as educationally or economically disadvantaged, which is their term, or as a member of a minority group, which was their term. In the years that that program had existed, when Bakke applied, 0 white students had been admitted through that program. And so he sued UC Davis and said they discriminated against him as a white applicant. The decision went all the way to the Supreme Court in 1978, and it fractured the court. 9 justices issued 6 opinions, and Justice Powell, pictured here, wrote the conclusive decision of the court. This decision is really important for us to consider in medicine. 1, because it centers how we as a nation have come to talk about racism and diversity right within the House of Medicine and in our medical schools. And 2, because it's going to introduce language that we have now had to contend with, how it serves us and how perhaps it disserves us now that we want to be actively anti-racist. What Justice Powell said is that racial and ethnic classifications of any sort are inherently suspect and call for the most exacting judicial scrutiny. But the goal of achieving a diverse student body is sufficiently compelling to justify consideration of race in admissions under some circumstances. Here, we see a transition between talking about using race as a way to redress racism in admissions decisions, and instead uplifting this concept of diversity as the compelling reason for us to consider race. His colleagues, Justice Powell's colleagues, went on to add to his decision, and in their statements, they said, the purpose of overcoming substantial chronic minority underrepresentation in the medical profession is sufficiently important to justify UC Davis's use of race to redress the lack of racial diversity in their classes. Again, here's the introduction of another term that we commonly use, underrepresentation, instead of talking about the process by which people don't come to be in medical schools, which is exclusion. Immediately after the decision was announced, there were protests across UC Davis's campus and across the country, because folks recognized that this decision was not just about what happens in medical school admissions. In fact, this affirmative action decision was about all of education and who could participate in employment and who could benefit from access to public housing, the many of the areas that people had been previously excluded from enjoying because of their racial background. And so today, when we talk about this anti-racist imperative, I want to break it up into 3 parts so it's a little bit more digestible. So to start, we're going to talk about what I'm going to call the anchors of diversity and inclusion, and that is the politics of representation that we often end up talking about. Then we're going to talk about the limitations of that approach to diversity and inclusion, and we're going to end with perhaps directions that we can move in to be more anti-racist. So let's jump in. When we talk about the politics of representation, it's important to recognize the different developmental stages organizations can be in as they try to address the fact that they have historically excluded certain racial and ethnic groups in the past. So the first developmental stage, and as a pediatrician, this is how I tend to conceptualize it. The first developmental stage, which is perhaps the most immature, is symbolic representation. Symbolic representation holds that the mere presence of someone from an underrepresented, quote unquote, group has meaning to the organization. Next is descriptive representation. Descriptive representation holds that institutions should demographically reflect the populations they serve. Often when people move from symbolic to descriptive, they then like to use benchmarks or number cutoffs to know that they are responding adequately to their institution's history of exclusion. And substantive representation is really the only one where, despite the makeup of an institution, institutions actually are called to act in the interests of the populations they serve. So symbolic representation tends to be reflected in an organization's values. It often finds itself in mission statements. Descriptive representation tends to find itself manifest in spreadsheets, benchmarks, dashboards, and numbers. And it's substantive representation that becomes this iterative process of systems change that tries to ensure that institutions serve the populations, act in the interest of the populations that they serve. So now we're going to go through each of those different developmental stages and talk about the benefits, but also some of the drawbacks. So for symbolic representation, although it is the least developmentally mature stage, it was important at a certain point in time. It was critical for institutions to allow at least one or a few members who were previously excluded to join an institution when they needed to counter the fact that when they needed to show that they were adhering to the new laws, right? So when there was discrimination de jure by law, allowing somebody to, when that was outlawed, allowing someone to enter the institution allowed them to show that they were complying with the new law. But when you only allow a couple people in, it can set the perception that the institution intends to really fully allow everyone in. Let's use what's happened in our US medical schools as an example. If we look starting in 1980, 2 years after the Bakke decision, up to 2016, we see that the racial and ethnic distribution of matriculants to US medical schools has barely changed. It went from 11.3% to 13.7%. This is despite the number of seats in US medical schools increasing by 27% over that time. So what was the change? This is data from the AAMC, and what they show is that the racial breakdown of US matriculants changed pretty significantly for white applicants white matriculants who went from 83% to 51%, and pretty significantly for Asian matriculants who went from 4% to 21%. But for Indigenous matriculants, it went down 0.1% from 0.4 to 0.3. For Black folks, it went up from 6 to 7. For Latinx folks, it went up just a smidge from 4.9 to 6.3. And then it went up in this other category, which is a catch-all that AAMC needs to disaggregate, but it includes non-US citizens, non-permanent residents, folks whose race wasn't known, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and folks who are bi or multiracial. When AAMC then looked to see, well, what are some of the barriers that might have been in the way for the racial groups that didn't see an enormous jump in their participation, they then found that there was a difference in acceptance rates by racial groups. And there was a particularly alarming difference for Black matriculants or Black applicants who had the lowest acceptance rate, which again is to just highlight the fact that even as we allow an increased number of racial and ethnic groups who were previously excluded to participate in medical school, there are still barriers that exist to people's equal participation. If we fast forward to the most recent year for which data is available from AAMC, we see that this trend continues from 1980 really up to 2019, where the half of that curve that's red is white matriculants who make up the majority, and the other largest slice that's turquoise in color is Asian matriculants who make up about a quarter of medical school matriculants. If we then look at how that might translate into participation in medical school faculty, we see that it matters that we have still exclusionary barriers to racial and ethnic groups fully participating in medical school. That the vast majority of faculty of medical schools, 63%, are white, and the second largest group that are faculty are Asian, 19.2%. If we look at our trainees, we see a similar distribution of participation there, where 42% of active residents are white, about 20% are Asian or Pacific Islander, 5% are Latinx, 4% are Black, 0.2% are Indigenous, and about a quarter, their race was unknown. The other benefit of symbolic representation is that people use it to establish this organizational perception that diversity is valued in the organization, which can be important. But one of the things that that does is anytime a group who's previously been excluded, a person from that group gets included, then people think that the only reason they're there is because they were from that previously excluded group. That can contribute to othering in the organization. The other benefit of symbolic representation is that it allows organizations to construct a progress narrative that advances the notion that it's fair to work in that organization. The problem with progress narratives, even though change has been made slowly in tiny increments over time, is that those narratives comfort those who are already well served by the system at the expense of those who are still calling out the barriers that continue to exist that exclude certain racial and ethnic groups from participating. Let's look at an example of this that happened over the summer. So over the summer, following the murder of George Floyd, a number of prominent organizations across the country made statements. And in particular, the lead heads of 4 major banks made a statement in CNBC. Here's the CEO of Wells Fargo, who noted that as a CEO, I can commit that our company will do all we can to support our diverse communities and foster a company culture that deeply values and respects diversity and inclusion. He said this in June, and then literally weeks later, which was reported to the media a few months later, he said in a private meeting with staff, while it might sound like an excuse, the unfortunate reality is there's a very limited pool of Black talent to recruit from. We hear this all the time. If folks stop with their own values as how they want to pursue anti-racist interventions, you actually miss all of the barriers that still exist in your organization for full inclusion. And we hear this, I feel like, in residencies commonly. When residency classes will be predominantly white, we'll say, well, we just didn't have a strong enough pool of applicants of color. And we fail when we do that to acknowledge the criteria we're using that is by definition exclusionary. And so what I'm calling us to confront right now by looking at Wells Fargo CEO is the ways we also can sometimes participate in symbolic representation and not recognize the ways that that continues to also be racist. So let's talk about descriptive representation. The benefit of depending on the numbers, right? Descriptive representation holds that an organization should demographically reflect the populations they serve. The benefit of that is that often programs will then create a separate structural lane for populations who are excluded. We sometimes call that structural lane pipelines. But the problem with pipelines is that it can fail to dismantle the barriers to predominant modes of entry. It's not that people need a back door to come in, it's that we have to open up the front door. I think the good historical example to use here is what's happened in public schools. This is a picture of Ruby Bridges in 1960 when she desegregated William Franz Elementary in New Orleans. So Brown v. Board was passed in 1954. For 6 years after Brown v. Board was passed, Black children in Ruby Bridges neighborhood went to segregated schools. After the Supreme Court of the nation said, desegregate schools, and followed up with a decision that said, with all deliberate speed, some Black students continue to go to segregated schools for 6 years. And Ruby Bridges, who was actually age 6 at this time, was the first to desegregate her public school. What we've seen is that since Ruby Bridges and the many folks who desegregated schools began to integrate public education, we have had a resegregation of public education. This is a map from ProPublica in 2018 that looks at areas of the country where Black students go to schools that are predominantly other Black students. And anywhere where it's darker blue are areas where that's most likely the case. As you can see, the areas of the country essentially where Black folks live is where Black students go to segregated schools. That's not benign because, as the Supreme Court said in 1954, separate is inherently unequal. And what we've seen is that segregated schools underperform. So this is a map that then looks at for the school districts where Black students go to school on average with more Black students, they also are on average more behind. So the darker blue here is the more grade levels they are behind. You can see the same pattern for Latinx students. This is looking at Latinx students who are more likely to go to school with other Latinx students. And again, these are just the areas of the country where Latinx students live. And again, those are the same areas of the country where you see large gaps in achievement. Achievement gaps matter because we know that if kids aren't performing well in school, those are the children who are most likely to drop out of school. And educational attainment is closely linked to life expectancy. And we know that kids that don't graduate high school have a lower life expectancy. And so it matters that we still in 2021 have failed to dismantle the major barrier just to attending public school that's equal. The other benefit of descriptive representation, particularly in our evidence-based culture, is that it gives us evidence. It gives us these numerical goals that can be a benchmark for success. But the problem with the number is that it misnames underrepresentation as the primary issue. Folks are not underrepresented, they are excluded. The other benefit of descriptive representation is it allows organizations to employ the business case to say, well, we should quote unquote diversify so that we can appeal to a quote unquote Browning population. But the problem with that is that it misnames the problem as primarily financial in scope. We're not trying to make money off of including people. We're including people we previously excluded because their exclusion was racist and wrong. So when we look at the numbers, we see that outside our field as well, there is a huge power imbalance. This is an article from New York Times in September that noted that across fields, the faces of power in this country are 80% white. And if we zoom into US hospitals, this is a report by the American Hospital Association that came out just last year, 86% of the faces of power in our hospital systems are white. If you then look at the leadership positions that folks of color, non-white folks tend to occupy in hospitals, it's usually the chief diversity officer. But it's much less likely that a non-white person would head up the other divisions that actually set care standards in hospitals. This is again data from AHA. And if we don't just look at CEOs, if you also compare board members, executive leadership, and first and mid-level managers, we see that there has been actually incredibly little progress to include folks who have been previously and continue to be excluded from leadership positions in hospitals based on their race. It matters because that contributes to an income gap in our field. This is just looking at clinicians themselves. So the largest income gap is between white male clinicians and Black women clinicians. And that gap is about $100,000, even if you hold constant the specialty and the years of experience and the area of the country that they work in. So let's get to substantive representation, which is where all of our organizations need to move. The benefit of substantive representation is that it allows organizations to abandon their group affiliation to actually serve folks well. You need not be Black to take care of Black patients with dignity. But when we say that we don't necessarily need to change our composition to start doing this work, sometimes organizations can use that to reify the dominant order and say, well, we'll do it without responding to the ways that we have excluded people in the past. And that really just results in silencing populations. The other benefit of substantive representation is it allows us to use institutional language, processes, and resources to actually address inequity. But the challenge there is that sometimes we elevate institutions above our role as individual change agents. And so we also need to own the fact that we are accountable for what our institutions do. And finally, substantive representation allows us to hold our institutions accountable, both for their actions and their inactions as defining their values. But in doing that, sometimes we miss that it's actually an iterative process and not simply a single destination that we're moving to. A good example of substantive representation is what's happening at the county hospital here in San Francisco, where they are considering what it would look like to sever their relationship with the sheriff's department. Instead of just waiting until there is an uproar from all of the staff about the sheriff's department, they are instead responding to the uproar from their patients about the sheriff's department and saying, then is it beholden on us to do something about this relationship to keep patients safe? So now let's talk about the limitations of how we typically use this frame. Again, returning to that language that the Supreme Court shared with us from that Bakke case, the substantial chronic minority underrepresentation in the medical profession actually arises from a long and bloody history of exclusion and white hegemony in America. While January 6th was absolutely a window into what that history may have looked like over our nation's past, that history of hegemony and exclusion didn't begin on January 6th. This is a newspaper article from 1934 in St. Petersburg, Florida, and it captures an event that is written about in this book. I don't know if you can still see me, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. This book won a Pulitzer. It is an excellent, profound book, and I just want to read a passage about what's captured in this article. As Wilkerson writes, that October, a 23-year-old colored farmhand named Claude Neal was accused of rape and murder of a 20-year-old white woman named Lola Kennedy. Neal had grown up across the road from Lola Kennedy's family. He was arrested and signed a written confession that historians have since called into question. But at the time, passions ran so high that a band of more than 300 men armed with guns, knives, torches, and dynamite went searching for Neal in every jail within a 75-mile radius of Mariana. The manhunt forced authorities to move Neal across the panhandle from Mariana to Panama City by car, to Camp Walton by boat, to Pensacola by car again, with the mob on their trail at every turn. Finally, the Escambia County Sheriff, fearing that his jail in Pensacola was too dilapidated to withstand attack, decided to take Neal out of the state altogether to the tiny town of Bruton, Alabama, 55 miles north of Pensacola. Someone leaked Neal's whereabouts, and a lynching party of some 100 men drove several hours on Highway 231 in a 30-car caravan from Florida to Alabama. There, the men managed to divert the local sheriff and overtake the deputy. They stormed the jail and took Neal, his limbs bound with a plow rope, back to Mariana. It was the early morning hours of October 26, a Friday. Neal's chief abductors, a self-described committee of 6, set the lynching for 8 p.m., when almost everyone would be off work. The advance notice allowed word to spread by radio, teletype, and afternoon papers to the Western time zones. Well before the appointed hour, several thousand people had gathered at the lynching site. The crowd grew so large and unruly, people having been given sufficient forewarning to come in from other states, that the Committee of 6, fearing a riot, took Neal to the woods by the Chipola River to wait out the crowds and torture him before the execution. This is graphic. There, his captors took knives and castrated him in the woods. Then they made him eat the severed body parts and, quote, say he liked it. One man threw up at the sight. Around Neal's neck, they tied a rope and pulled it over a limb to the point of his choking before lowering him to take up the torture again. Every now and then, someone would cut off a finger or toe. Then the men used hot irons to burn him all over his body in a ritual that went on for several hours. Quote, it is almost impossible to believe that a human being could withstand such unspeakable torture for such a long period, end quote, wrote the white undercover investigator retained by the NAACP. The crowd waiting in town never got to see Neal die. The Committee of 6 finally decided to just kill him in the woods. His new body was then tied to the back of a car and dragged to the Kennedy house, where men, women, and children stabbed the corpse with sticks and knives. The dead girl's father was angry that Neil was killed before he could get to him. The committee hanged the body from an oak tree on the courthouse lawn. People reportedly displayed Neil's fingers and toes as souvenirs. Postcards of his dismembered body went for 50 cents each. When the sheriff cut down the body the next morning, a mob of as many as 2,000 people demanded that it be rehanged. When the sheriff refused to return it to the tree, the mob attacked the courthouse and rampaged through Mariana, attacking any colored person they ran into. The Florida governor, David Schultz, had to call in the National Guard. The NAACP compiled a 16-page report and more files on the Neil case than any other lynching in American history. Afterwards, it was learned that Neil and the dead girl, who had known each other all their lives, had been lovers, and that people in her family who discovered the liaison may have been involved in her death. I just want to take a pause here. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, we are talking about the violent exclusion and extreme torture at times of folks of color, especially Black people in this country. And so we have to ask ourselves, how does this language that we've introduced around representation and diversity help us engage that bloody history and respond to it with justice? If we turn to symbolic diversity only, it simply offers us the first. It says we should celebrate the fact that in 2021, Black folks will be the first person to have a position of power in an institution. Sometimes symbolic diversity and symbolic representation asks us to celebrate the model minority, the idea that there are certain minority groups, and usually this is applied to Asian minority groups, that are preferred, that other racial groups should act like them so that they are then worthy of inclusion. Descriptive diversity is frankly no better because it simply offers us the seats at the table without being able to set the agenda about what's going to happen at that table. It's only substantive diversity that allows us to name racism and to fix racism as a systems issue that we are all responsible for. When it comes to public institutions' mission statements, a number are incredibly comfortable talking about diversity, 75%, but only 20% even name racial and ethnic diversity specifically as the diversity that they're talking about. Since May 2020 and the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings from Movement for Black Lives, something has shifted in medicine. If we look across all of the medical societies that are represented in the Council of Medical Specialty Societies, which includes 800,000 physicians in this country, 43 of the 45 member associations released a statement about racism following the uprisings of the summer. But to my knowledge, there have been no national statements on behalf of medical associations or hospital associations that publicly acknowledge white supremacy and its harms. So the problem with symbolic and descriptive approaches to diversity and inclusion is that they don't give us the language we need to talk about race as a product of racism and the racial inequity that white supremacy creates. And it doesn't give us a process to actually combat racism and racial inequity. Without that language to actually talk about racial inequity as a product of racism, we in medicine have developed a deep aversion to confronting white hegemony, white supremacy, white privilege, and white normativity. So I'm going to define these terms so that we can use them in our anti-racist practice. So white hegemony refers to forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that establish and enforce racial hierarchies in which white folks nearly exclusively hold decision-making power. Medicine is a white patriarchal hegemony. White supremacy refers to forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that creates and maintains a racial ordering of humans and resources that reinforces the racial dominance of whites. White privilege refers to the forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that preferences white folks through disproportionate access to resources associated with mobility. White normativity refers to the forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that naturalizes power asymmetries between white and non-white folks as being primarily meritocratic. This is where we say, well, the reason that person has power is because they deserve it more than another group. If we don't develop a defined process to actually address racial inequity as a product of racism and white supremacy, then we continue to participate in the process that disconnects that long and bloody history of racism and white supremacy from all of its intergenerational harms. That's never been more clear than what's happening in this pandemic. This is data from APM Research Labs that looks just over the last month at the continuing widening of racial inequities in mortality for COVID. As we see, Indigenous populations have the highest COVID mortality rate now, and Black Americans have the second highest, followed by Pacific Islanders, Latinx folks, white folks, and then Asian populations. If we then overlay who has access to the COVID-19 vaccine, we see that despite having higher COVID mortality rates, Black and Latinx populations are at the back of the line. In a piece of good news, Indigenous populations are at the front of the line, which is critical. But we also have to acknowledge that the reason that that's the case is because Indigenous tribes are given the choice of whether to have states distribute their vaccine or the Indian Health Service. And so this is truly a credit to the Indian Health Service that they are doing such an excellent job vaccinating their patient population. Overall, if you look at the 24 states reporting vaccination rates by race, white folks have a vaccination rate that's 3 times higher than Latinx folks and twice as high as the rate for Black folks. And so let's talk about what we have to do about that. So first, one of the take-homes is that valuing difference is not an antidote to racism. It won't fix it. While we appreciate people's values and intentions can be incredibly important, it doesn't actually do anything to fix racism. A great example of that, to then just close the loop on our affirmative action story, is what has happened to affirmative action over the last 30 to 40 years. And what we see is that even despite cases like Bakke's, we continue to have more folks who are white and Asian continue to gain admission to US higher education and less folks who are Black and Latinx, which is a sign that there continues to be exclusionary barriers to equal participation in higher education in this country. To bring the example back to medicine and leadership in our own field, again, valuing difference won't fix things, because when we actually look at what we do with the data we collect on our patients' race and ethnicity, we rarely actually apply it to things that might change their health outcomes. So this is looking at how hospitals use racial and ethnic data to identify patterns. And you can see that none of these things are like 90%. So, and the lowest one is only 8%. So we are not doing a good job actually applying what we know about exclusion and discrimination and how racism works to actually improve health outcomes. Inclusion, frankly, is also not an antidote to racism. Even if we were to achieve whatever we all decide is the acceptable, desirable, or sufficient number of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other professionals of color who have been historically excluded, even if we meet that number, it doesn't necessarily change the institutional norms and policies. What that means is when folks get included, they are then asked to assimilate to an institution that harms people who look like them, right? Or if not assimilate, to be silenced as the institution continues to harm folks who look like them. Or we invite people into the institution to then do the uncompensated, unrewarded, invisible labor of diversity and inclusion work, right? We already saw that of the leadership positions in hospitals, folks of color typically are offered the chief diversity officer role and not the other roles. Other than the chief diversity officer role, most of the work that happens around diversity and inclusion isn't compensated, and it isn't included in people's promotion as a part of their academic success. So the problem with inclusion, as in thinking that inclusion might work alone, is that it substitutes the symptom that folks aren't there for the etiology. They're not there because of racist forms of exclusion. And so it's critical to just say Black, Indigenous, and Latinx and other professionals of color are not underrepresented. They are excluded by the very criteria we use to determine who is deserving of the opportunity of participation in our field. And when included, folks of color are then included in systems that have historically demeaned, devalued, or discriminated against folks who look like them. And sometimes that historic demeaning is actually current practice. This process then becomes intergenerational. And so as organizations, we have to move towards substantive politics of representation. So if we take a substantive approach to anti-racism, we actually then have to move towards abolition of racism. When we typically think about abolishing racism, we usually have to contend with these competing frameworks about resource distribution, right? We have to say, right now we are talking more about equity instead of equality, acknowledging that populations should have resources kind of commiserate with their need. But as Angela Davis teaches us, this image of how we imagine resource distribution actually has become a reflection of how difficult it is for us to envision a social order and our own advocacy strategies that don't rely upon the fence. Even as we call right now for equity, that we might respond to people's needs, we might give people resources commiserate with their need, we don't have to call out the fence to do that. And it's truly the fence that's the problem. And so abolition of racism would mean that we have to get into the business of actually breaking down fences. To do that, we need to use critical race theory, which tells us that we have to center at the margins to understand what people's needs even are. So rather than anyone being short in that picture, instead communities are divested in, or folks are ensnared in the carceral system. And that prevents them from even seeing the resources or experiences that they don't have full access to. And in the setting of some folks being intentionally disadvantaged, other folks are intentionally advantaged, such that they can participate in ways that other groups cannot. This is a schematic by artist Ari Galili, and it was in an excellent paper in academic psychiatry by one of my colleagues at UCLA, Nicolas Barcelo. As they call us, we actually have to confront the ways that racial inequality is constructed and perpetuated. And one of those ways that it's perpetuated in academic medicine is that we actually profit off racism. This is an excellent article in Annals of Internal Medicine that folks can check out that looks at segregation in hospitals as a way we profit off racism, but it also looks at some of the wage gaps. Earlier in this presentation, we pointed to some of the wage gaps that exist because the faces of power in medicine are predominantly white. But if we look across our entire workforce, not just at physicians, we see that the wage gaps widen even greater, and that approximately half of Black female healthcare workers actually earn less than $15 an hour, a percentage that's almost double that of their white counterparts. And so substantive representation calls us to have anti-racist strategic plans to do more than simply nothing, because doing nothing is inherently racist. This is a quote from Kamara Jones. Substantive representation also calls us to truth, reconciliation, and reparations. Truth means identifying the ways our organizations have benefited from, participated in, or ignored and remain silent around forms of racism. Reconciliation means we should apologize for all of those ways that we've done that. And reparations means we should move to repair it. And you guys actually have a great example of this. When residents publicly kind of protested and got media attention about not being prioritized for the vaccine, you guys went through the most rapid public process of truth, reconciliation, and reparations I have seen recently, right? You guys, as a medical system, apologized immediately. You said, we were wrong. We take full responsibility. And then even said that in 1 week, you would fix it. As we have gone a year of this pandemic with disparate mortality rates for folks of color, who has been willing to move within 1 week to make sure we fix it? As we continue to see the vaccine roll out in inequitable ways in your institution and mine, who has said in 1 week, we are going to fix it? That's the level of urgency we need around anti-racism. The level of urgency that we're willing to apply to our colleagues and our own field, we have to apply to the patients that we serve as well. We need mandated education around these topics, as colleagues and I called for in the New England Journal last year. And we finally have to desegregate and then transform our institutions. And so when we're talking about diversity, we're not talking about diverse perspectives. We are talking about the human beings who have been excluded and then told they were less deserving as the reason for their exclusion. And so once we desegregate our health institutions, we then have to restructure them to prevent regression towards accepted and prevailing forms of exclusion. Finally, we have to talk about what it means to build sanctuary within our institutions, because truly folks of color and Black people especially live without sanctuary from the many ways that racism threatens and shortens our lives. This is just an article that I thought was really powerful about what it means to create sanctuary for our colleagues. Specifically, it talks about what this Black physician felt like when she walked into our hospital without her white coat on. I recommend folks check it out. So to close, anti-racism is systems change work, but it requires a commitment to truth, reconciliation, and reparations for everybody, not just our colleagues. It looks like processes to unlearn and dismantle, which have to occur alongside processes to reimagine and build a new way of engaging. And it should feel like loving sanctuary from forms of oppression and even passive harms. So I will close here and open it for questions.
Dr. Boyd, I just want to say I remember saying earlier how wonderful a speaker you are, and your ability to deliver this important content is just, I'm so amazed by the way you speak. Thank you so much for presenting and talking about this important topic. There's a couple of questions here. I wanted to add to those, and if I have time, I have my as well for you. Maybe I'll go to a couple of the questions that are listed here first, and we can start with. So we have Iman Bari. We have looked up. She's a MD candidate at Mahari Medical College, and we have a lot of students rotating through here. So Iman, thanks for joining with us today. She asks, can you speak how integration historically just means placing Black and brown students in white supremacist environments? I worry about the potential implication of saying segregated schools rather than underfunding leads to underperformance.
Brilliant question, Iman. This is why I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that simple inclusion actually is no anecdote to racism. So to underscore your point, you're absolutely right that our institutions actually have to transform themselves if they are going to be anti-racist. And most institutions in those developmental stages are either at symbolic or attempting for the descriptive stage. It's very rare to have organizations that are actually willing to upend their entire power structure to ensure that they don't continue to perpetuate those prevailing forms of exclusion. So I think you're absolutely right. And the reason, to your second point, the reason children of color don't perform well in schools is because separate is unequal, which we've known now for 70 years. So you are right, Iman. I'm excited that you're going to be a doctor.
Dr. Boyd, Dr. Weinberg asks, given white resistance to racism as an explanation for both societal structures and personal behavior, could Wilkinson's use of caste shift the conversation positively or just be a distraction?
This is a great question. And one, I think it's an example of all of the different ways that Black folks in particular, and maybe just Isabel Wilkerson in most specifically, has attempted new ways to try to get white folks to confront the fact that racism and white supremacy benefits white folks, and that means white folks have to do something about it. We have tried a million ways. If talking directly about racism doesn't work, now she's talking about caste. I think caste is useful because it just talks about how durable our system of racism is, such that you could compare it to something like caste in India. But so first, I always agree with Isabel Wilkerson, but I'm also of the camp that white folks might never be ready to change. It's not that we don't have the language, it's that people don't want to surrender the power and advantage that they have because they profit from it financially and interpersonally. Du Bois talks about the psychological wage of whiteness, that just being white makes people feel more powerful, even if you don't have the material resources that it can also confer. And so I think we now have to move beyond white folks' readiness. It was James Baldwin who said, you know, how long are we going to have to wait for white folks to be ready for us to actually progress past their own supremacy? Like, it took his grandparents' time, it took his cousin's time, it took his lifetime. And if we are honest with ourselves, it is going to take our lifetime. It may take our children's lifetime and their children's lifetime. So, you know, white folks may never be ready. So that's why uprisings are critical, so that we force the point.
Excellent. Julian Twiggs asks, she says, that was an incredible presentation, Dr. Boyd. As we move away from tokenism and towards substantive representation across our society, how do we motivate the power holders and decision makers who are largely white to give up the power that they historically have held? Some are advocates, many remain silent on the subject of structural racism.
Anyone who remains silent on the subject of structural racism isn't an advocate. And I think if you have leaders who are not being forthright about talking about this, we have to rethink how we select our leaders, and who gets to be in the process of selecting who gets to be a leader, and who gets to be in the process of selecting the criteria we use to determine who even gets to be promoted, and whose work we value and whose work we don't value. So I think it will be difficult to move the system. And the reason it hasn't changed in all of the centuries of this country's existence is because of how hard that is, that people who have power don't give it up. People rarely concede their power. It often has to be taken. And I think aligning ourselves, being organized and aligning ourselves with larger movements across society is what will bring this change.
Dr. Boyd, do you have is it okay if we go over a couple minutes? We have a few questions here.
Sure, yeah.
Wonderful. No surprise, there's a lot of questions popping up here, but we'll try to get to a few more if that's okay. I don't want to take too much of your time, but Dr. Shauna Folis says, thank you, Dr. Boyd. You are an incredible leader. Symbolic and inclusion anecdotes are disproportionately selected by leadership. Do you have advice for employees to voice their thoughts on these methods and to move towards a system change?
Yes, you know, I present these terms so that you guys, I hope, can use them now. So when you see your institution relying on just symbolic forms of diversity or offering these progress narratives when there's clear barriers that still exist to people's equal participation or benefit from participation in an institution, call them out, name them as they are, and then hopefully using these building blocks, and I'll share these slides with you all, using these building blocks, you can make the argument for why that will never be enough. So thank you for asking that question.
Great. Dr. Molina asks, very much enjoyed your presentation. Many academic medical institutions have set up diversity and inclusion committees, initiatives, and again, committees. What advice do you give them to operationalize some of the action items you discuss to affect change that combats racism in addition to increasing diversity?
One of the things is to demand to be compensated for the time that you're spending on those committees. Institutions benefit from having these diversity and inclusion efforts. And although many institutions often don't fund those committees, or those committees are over, there is a larger proportion of like residents or younger faculty on those committees than there are of higher level leaders or even like the executive leadership on those committees typically. I think you should ask to be compensated for your time. It's really critical that we start to set some just basic thresholds around the work that we do to show that our institutions do value it. Like, instead of saying you value diversity and inclusion, the way you show organizations value it is to compensate people for their time and consider that work a part of their scholarly work as well. So organizing as a group and knowing how valuable your work is, and then setting a number and asking the institution to support that number, I think is critical.
I was about to close, and I just saw a question pop up from Dr. Valentine, so I definitely want to ask that one. Dr. Valentine asks, thank you, Dr. Boyd, for an outstanding reframing of the issues towards systemic change. I completely agree the focus must be on institutional change, which needs to change behavioral change. that is hard, but teaches us that it can be incentivized, will not occur without us. So more of a comment, any thoughts on what she said? I think you know Dr. Valentine, she's in for our School of Medicine, and well, I could spend 10 minutes talking about all the great things she does, but I was happy to have her comment.
Hi, Dr. Valentine. Yes, thank you for all of your wonderful work. I agree. We have to shift the incentive structures because, as we said, racism is profitable. Shifting those incentive structures, though, is also a larger lift. And so the other thing that I'll end on is that we can't small hanging fruit our way to justice. There is no tiny little incremental change we can make that'll move us closer. And that's typically where leaders want to start. We have to change the incentive structures, which are the foundation, the business model on which medicine and our institutions rest. And so we have to start to begin that work. It should start from us. And if it doesn't start from us, I think as advocates have shown us in their uprisings across the summer, people will call for it and we will be forced into doing it. So I hope we take the initiative and the leadership to actually investigate the ways that we profit off racism and to shift those incentive structures.
Dr. Boyd, thank you so much again for your talk. I just want to end on a few comments here. People are saying, Deanna Greater State, profound thank you for your work and presentation. Carolyn Mandan, stunning talk. Thank you for this work. We usually want to get comments like that. That means I'm going to get a ton of emails and comments of how wonderful the talk was after this. So thank you so much for being a wonderful presenter and really being an advocate here. You're welcome to come back anytime and present and join us in any possible way. Thanks for everybody for sticking with us. Dr. Dunn, thanks for the intro, and the panelists for being with us in the background answering questions. I hope everybody has a great day and week, and we'll see you later. Thanks again, Dr. Boyd.
Thank you.